the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. This is Crystal Downing, David Downing, and Aaron Hill joining together in a conversation that continues to look at the essays by C.S. Lewis that were published after his death by his executor, Walter Hooper. What's interesting about the essays we're talking about today is they have different content than we've been discussing most recently in our podcasts, where Lewis was grappling with the modernist deification of science in his day, and what he is focusing on and that what we'll be focusing on today is the modernist deification of art. Now, part of this goes back to what is often called the Victorian faith crisis, where Darwin and other scientists were calling into question the legitimacy of Scripture. And so the Victorians were looking for alternative means to establish morality and truth.
Oh, okay.
And hence, truth can come through science and art.
And he identifies Matthew Arnold as the first person who started developing almost a religion of culture.
Right.
All the best that has been thought and said.
Yeah.
Right. In fact, listen to this statement in The Study of Poetry by Matthew Arnold. And Lewis mentions Matthew Arnold in both of these essays. And maybe we should give the title of the essays first. Okay, so first essay we'll be talking about is Christianity and Literature, which he read to a religion society in Oxford. It was published in 1939. That probably means he gave this lecture in 1938, so before the war.
Oh, wow.
And then a very related essay called Christianity and Culture, which was published in a journal called Theology in March of 1940. So Matthew Arnold comes up both times in these essays, and he was a brilliant poet. He wrote one of my favorite poems all time called Dover Beach, and the poem explicitly talks about the disappearance of
Faith.
the ability, to trust in Jesus Christ. And Matthew Arnold in Dover Beach says, the sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its long, melancholy, withdrawing roar, retreating to the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world.
I think it'd be great to have a postcard of Dover Beach and then have that on the back when you turn it over.
Yeah.
So Matthew Arnold just wrote all this poetry over his despair about loss of faith. And yet he had this view that poetry should build us up, should energize our souls. So he just gave up writing poetry and started writing literary criticism.
Oh, wow.
And here's something, and this is definitely what C.S. Lewis is thinking about when he is writing the two essays that we will talk about today. There is an essay called The Study of Poetry, published in 1880, where Arnold says, more and more mankind will discover that we have to turn to poetry to interpret life for us, to console us, to sustain us. Without poetry, our science will appear incomplete, and most of what now passes with us for religion and philosophy will be replaced by poetry.
Huh.
That's pretty intense.
Gee whiz.
Well, didn't Percy Bysshe Shelley say that poets will be the new priest of the world, the new priesthood of the world?
Unacknowledged legislators of the world is what
legislators of the world.
What Shelley said, yes.
By the way, boo. We had one of our listeners say that we're a very easy listening podcast, and they sometimes fall asleep as they're listening.
So you're waking
they
them
meant it
up.
as a compliment, but I just want to make sure.
I thought you were going to move into some extemporaneous poem or something, some sort of jam session.
No, I just want to make sure we're still listening. The interesting thing about Arnold is, there was this huge Victorian faith crisis. There was biblical criticism. There was Darwinism. There is no creator. The appearance of design is only the results of evolution. And when he was writing, the Victorians had kind of a high view of art in terms of, if you read Browning is inspiring, Tennyson is inspiring, even the novels, George Eliot writes novels really about improving society. But literature and culture couldn't bear that weight. And by the time you get to modernist poetry and literature, it's not anything you would think of as building a religion around. There's a lot of novels about neuroses and violence and alienation and kind of the breakdown of community. And so I think he lived at a time where most public poets and novelists were trying to write edifying material.
Yeah.
But within the next generation, nobody's going to say, let's do a religious meeting and read The Wasteland. Let's all get inspired and edified by Ezra Pound.
Well, so I was going to ask you guys, so I have a question about this. What was it about poetry or culture that they thought could provide some sort of substitute for religion? How did they see it as a substitute for religion? Was it for morality? Are they getting morality from it? Are they getting a shared language or shared culture from it? What were they looking to get from poetry? Because my upbringing was like Shel Silverstein poems, so I'm sort of struggling to see how you can form something from that beyond quoting poems to each other. You know what I mean?
Well, it almost goes back to a Platonic view that we should be aiming for truth, beauty, and goodness. And of course, Plato was before Christianity.
Gotcha.
And so they say, well, if we can't get truth, beauty, and goodness from Christianity, we can get it from art. So Tennyson will say something like In Memoriam, which was published in 1850, and that's the reason he became poet laureate. He said, there is more faith in honest doubt than in all of the creeds. So the creeds aren't giving us the answer. It's doubt, and it's the doubts we're expressing in poetry.
Gotcha. And so if science is providing the truth, then poetry is providing the beauty and the goodness?
And the meaning.
Yes.
I think they saw poetry, a lot of it as meaning making. And they were very high-minded as a group. They tended to want to write edifying novels and poems. There was sort of this underground movement of more unsavory stuff. But in general, the Victorians tended to be very earnest. One of the words they talk about among the Victorians is earnestness. But by the time you get to Oscar Wilde and the importance of being earnest, he's mocking that whole idea. He's mocking that high-minded sincerity. So it was kind of untimely of Arnold to try to look to art and culture and literature to provide moral values, to provide meaning, right as literature is sort of breaking up and expressing individual alienation much more than community values.
Yeah, but there was still a type of religion of art. It's just that the modernist poets thought of themselves as the high priests.
Yeah.
And
Right.
they were doing something, whereas the plebeian masses, they don't get what we're doing.
Yeah.
Another person that C.S. Lewis mentions in these essays is E.M. Forster, who was a novelist. And Forster wrote, information points to something else. In other words, just normal language points to something else. A poem points to nothing but itself. Information is relative. A poem is absolute. It is eternal and indestructible. Talk about the religion of art.
Gee
right.
whiz.
And then another person that Lewis mentions in this essay is I.A. Richards, who in 1926 says, countless pseudo-statements about God, about the universe, about human nature, about the soul, its rank and destiny have suddenly become, for sincere, honest, and informed minds, impossible. For centuries they have been believed. Now they are gone, irrecoverably. However, if we can contrive to believe poetry, then the world seems, while we do so, to be transfigured. So these are the 1920s that and people that Lewis is citing. And another 1920 statement, literature is not just a subject for academic study, but one of the chief temples of the human spirit in which all should worship.
Wow.
I know. Okay, so...
But even English departments, when you think of the humanities, you think of history, philosophy, theology, and English. But the study of English as a academic discipline didn't come into being until about the same time.
Yes. Yes.
Classical language was receding. People didn't know Latin and Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And so they started saying, well, let's just study English literature. And it took on this kind of quasi-religious energy.
Right,
Huh.
right. In fact, one of the persons who instigated like a major, you could take an English major. They did when Lewis went to university, there wasn't an English major. You
Yeah.
studied the classics, right?
Yeah, that was a new thing for him. He actually switched from the classics and philosophy to English literature because it was a new discipline
Right.
in Oxford in the 20s and in America.
Right.
Wow.
You couldn't get an English major in 1890. There was no
Right.
such thing.
And he kind of retained this snobbery about recent literature. He actually said that anybody who needs a professor to help them understand Dickens probably needs a nurse to wipe his nose.
Right.
Yeah. So, but that's because he grew up at a time
Yeah.
where Dickens was just an entertainer.
Yeah.
Whereas when I last taught Dickens about 5 years ago, I had students who struggled
Yeah.
with Dickens.
Well, I
all
think
people.
there's an element in which each work of art, each piece of literature is produced in a time, and there's references, and there's cultural assumptions, and there's a background, and you can get so far away from it that you don't understand all of those things, and that's where you do need somebody, or you need like an annotated edition of something like David's done for some of Lewis's books
Right.
to help you understand those references. Otherwise, you go back and you read it and you go, "What are they talking about here? I don't understand."
Well, it's in a way, Lewis was counter-modernist, but he was also a brave public intellectual
Yes.
because everybody agreed. There was this consensus that literature was very serious. Literature was culture building, and everybody really treated it with kind of religious reverence.
Yeah.
And he says at one point, well, I take a great deal of pleasure out of reading literature, but I wouldn't try to make it into a substitute for religion.
Yeah.
It's kind of ironic because he's talking about how you shouldn't take literature and culture too seriously, but then he gives all these lists of figures, these
Yeah.
Christian
Yeah.
figures.
Yeah.
And you go, you're being pretty cultivated for a guy who doesn't worship
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah. Well, can we talk about the first
Yes.
essay?
Good.
Is it Christianity and
And
literature?
literature.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because a journal was begun called Christianity and Literature. I wonder if they knew about Lewis's essay and borrowed it, or it's just so generic. Anybody could
T.S.
do that.
Eliot had written a book called Religion and Literature, which was mainly about Christianity. I suspect that this essay has partly to do with taking shots at Eliot.
Oh.
Lewis always had a chip on his shoulder about Eliot, the American and the modernist, coming over to England and kind of captivating English literary culture around London. A good anthology would be take everything Lewis wrote to try and refute Eliot, and the title would be "Eliot is an Idiot." Essays by C.S. Lewis. His Paradise Lost
Would
book.
we give Eliot a voice in this discussion?
No, he would be. Well, actually, they talk about Scrutiny, which is a literary journal, which once again elevated literature that you should pick out the moral values. And this is very good literature because it's pro-social, and this is bad literature. And even Eliot later in life said the editors of that journal had gotten too shrill. They were too quick to praise or condemn without looking at the actual value of the work. So they even, these people even out-Elioted Eliot.
Well, what's interesting about this essay is he starts out kind of saying, like, you guys asked me to talk about Christianity and literature.
Right.
Yeah.
And for a long time, I thought, that's a dumb topic. Why would I talk about that? What do I have to say?
Yeah.
And he kind of starts out saying, like, there is no such thing as like Christian literature.
Yes.
Because he says, I question whether it has any literary qualities peculiar to itself, meaning Christian literature. The rules for writing a good passion play or a good devotional lyric are simply the rules for writing tragedy or lyric in general. Success in sacred literature depends on the same qualities of structure, suspense, variety, diction, and the like, which secure success in secular literature. So he's kind of setting it up, and then later on he mocks Christian cookbooks.
Yeah.
Well,
And he has this line about boiling an egg is the same whether you're a Christian or a pagan.
Yeah.
So, what would make a Christian cookbook? And he kind of settles on it would have to be something that where the recipes are, they avoid animal cruelty or they're excessively luxurious. And so it's the topic that is Christian or something like that, because the actually doing the thing, boiling an egg or writing a novel, you're still doing the same things to produce literature
Right.
or a dish.
Yeah, I think he's saying as a subject, it's like Christian cookery or Christian sports writing. Why would it be any different than the
Yeah.
secular version?
Right. It
Unless
goes back.
it has Christian values embedded in the process.
Right. In fact, he said he is more interested in defining a Christian approach to literature.
Mhm.
So he says you can't have Christian literature because there is some great literature written by secularists, like, for instance, George Eliot's Middlemarch, where you have this character, Dorothea Casaubon, whose belief is that we should make life better for each other. I mean, it's a very Christian approach, but Eliot wasn't a Christian.
So this is one of those things where the modernists started satirizing that attitude.
Yes.
W.H. Auden, who was a Christian, he said, we're all put on life to help each other, and we're all put on the world to help each other. What they're put on the world for, I have no idea.
Well, I think the modernists, they absorbed the Victorian and Arnoldian deification of art, but they became oppressed with the Victorian emphasis on morality. You just got to do the right thing. And, you know, even people will talk about, oh, that's Victorian prudery. So the modernists wanted to do whatever they wanted. But then you feed your soul by reading poetry or looking at great art or expressing yourself. And Lewis in this essay actually says he hates that idea of literature as self-expression. And that was very modernist.
I need to pick up this poem and be edified and get this quasi-religious meaning of the universe. So here's the poem. There once was a man from Nantucket.
David! David!
That's not very edifying.
Well, he has a good, I thought he had an interesting point in here. He starts talking about different types of creations, and he brings up icons and sort of Christian beauty. And I thought that was a very interesting distinction. He has a quote in here. He says, I do not think the icon on the work of art can be so sharply distinguished in literature. I question whether the badness of a really bad hymn can ordinarily be so irrelevant to devotion as the badness of a bad devotional picture. Because the hymn uses words, its badness will to some degree consist in confused or erroneous thought and unworthy sentiment. And so he's trying to make the point that you could actually make an ugly icon. He even says it could be just like two sticks lashed together, and it could elicit devotion in someone. But a bad hymn or a bad novel, a bad Christian novel,
a bad Christian movie,
is just going to be a bad hymn and a bad novel, and because it's trying to use words and it's doing a poor job of what it's trying to do, and it's not going to communicate what the message is intended to do in a good way.
He goes back to this idea in his later book, Experiment and Criticism. An icon and a toy do not have to be exquisitely made. A little child can love her teddy bear who's very primitive.
Yeah.
And a saint can love two popsicle sticks that are glued together.
Yeah.
Because you don't need the external beauty.
Yeah.
He calls that using them for some other purpose. In Experiment Criticism, he says rather than distinguish between good books and bad books, let's talk about good ways of reading and bad ways of reading.
Oh.
And a good way of reading is to really receive the work and look at it as a work and understand its artistry.
Yes.
He said a bad way, it's okay if you're not trying to be receiving art. If you see a simple icon or a simple toy, you're using it for other purposes. And he said the great danger is when people read a novel or a poem or see a play, and all they want to do is to use it to back up their point of view or to...
or to criticize it.
It's interesting reading Lewis because that one paragraph on the icon and the toy being images which can be used for other purposes rather than the beauty of the artifact. He goes back and develops that idea into a whole book in Experiment.
Well, it just stood out to me because with the hymn, it's a thing that people have discussions about. Somebody publishes a modern worship song and you read the lyrics and you go, like, this is a heresy or this is really awful theology. And it just reminded me of the fact that you can get some of those things wrong just because it's a Christian thing and there was creativity that went into it. When you're talking about something that has theological implications, you have to be very careful about what you write in a hymn because it's not just a bad hymn, it can be a heretical hymn. Whereas a picture of Jesus, you could get it wrong and the skin color and it, that poor lady that tried to restore that mosaic of Jesus, and then you look at it and it looks like this like screaming lady with a muff around her neck. Have you guys not seen that in Spain?
No.
It was a picture of Jesus in like a tomb or something, and this lady in Spain went in and tried to fix it. And it just looked, it looked horrible. She totally destroyed it.
When I was growing up, a lot of the badness of songs we sang in Sunday school, they said, he keeps me singing a happy song. He keeps me singing it all day long. and he gives me joy, 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 joy down in my heart. And Christian faith was becoming a product which makes you happy. It was kind of like whitening toothpaste. And so use this product and you will be happy. And as a kid, I wasn't a particularly joyful kid. And I always felt like somehow I'm not getting the joy of the Lord. Somehow all this positive energy isn't flowing into me.
Mm-hmm.
And later on, they should have said, feel free to be a Christian. This should be a hymn. Feel free to be a Christian, even if you have low serotonin levels. God loves you anyway. So to me, part of the badness was they were really misleading children into what Christian faith is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, another person that C.S. Lewis names in this essay is Walter Pater, who was a literary critic. In fact, Walter Pater is the person who coined the term the Mona Lisa for that famous painting. He has an essay celebrating Da Vinci's art. But Walter...
Wait, it didn't have a name before that?
No, he called it the Mona Lisa.
I thought it was called La Gioconda.
It was called La Gioconda. Sorry.
What?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I just learned something new.
Yeah, it was this Victorian
Hence
critic.
the purpose of this podcast.
I know.
Yeah.
So Pater is considering art kind of the way David just described Christians who invent songs where Christianity is all about making me happy. It's all about me. And so that becomes heretical. And it reflects what became this modernist view, as Pater says. What is this song or picture, this engaging personality presented in life or in a book to me? What effect does it really produce on me?
Oh, wow.
Does it give me pleasure? And if so, what sort of or degree of pleasure? How is my nature modified by its presence and under its influence?
Oh my gosh. That is like the reading prompt for every, modern English class or discussion on any sort of work of art. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, it's almost like the way people read the Bible and say, how does this apply to me? It's almost like, how does this work of art affect me? How does it apply to me?
Yeah.
And Peter, when he declaimed those words, he pronounced them exactly the way Crystal did.
Well,
it's all about me. It's about my response.
He was a big influence on Oscar Wilde.
Well, what I find interesting is in this essay, so what Lewis does is he turns to the New Testament.
Yes.
And he, we don't need to get into his analysis of scripture and his interpretation here because he gets kind of technical. But the thing that he comes out the other side after looking at the New Testament is essentially to say that in the New Testament, the art of life itself is an art of imitation.
Yes.
The goal is for us to imitate, to be more like Christ, as Christ is like the Father. And so he says, believing this, we can believe that literature, which must derive from real life, is to aim at being creative, original, spontaneous. Originality in the New Testament is quite plainly the prerogative of God alone. Even within the triune being of God, it seems that confined to the Father. The duty and happiness of every other being is placed in being derivative and for reflecting like a mirror. So his conclusion is, in the New Testament, what we learn is that the sort of end of existence, the reason, what it means to be a human being is to reflect, to be a mirror, image. He gives the example of a boy imitating his father as Jesus maybe imitated his father in the workshop, learning how to, be a carpenter or whatever. And that if that's the goal, then things like originality and being spontaneous and being creative and being true to yourself is actually the antithesis of Christian literature, which is and then he applies that to the people of his day and age who had elevated that to some sort of religion.
Right. I love this line in the essay. He says, the Christian artist should ask of every idea and every method, he will ask not, is it mine, but is it good?
Yes.
That was a good way of putting it. Once again, he's fighting against this whole ethos of genius and originality.
Yeah. It's interesting because the word genius comes from the Latin, and it just originally meant a guiding spirit that helped direct a person's life. But then by the end of the 18th century, and of course the 18th century is when Christianity started being questioned. Voltaire says, crush the vile thing about Christianity in the 18th century.
Yeah, écraser les vile thing in the 18th century.
I don't think he used the word vile, but something like that. So by the end of the 18th century, the word genius had taken on new meaning. And this is what the OED credits as the current definition of genius. quote, native and intellectual the OED, sorry, is the Oxford English Dictionary. It's kind of considered the definitive dictionary.
That was a very professorial way to refer to it, but yes.
Yeah. So, genius, native intellectual power of an exalted type, such as is attributed to those who are esteemed greatest in any department of art. Isn't that interesting? Art, they're reflecting that Victorian modernist idea. Any department of art, speculation, or practice, instinctive and extraordinary capacity for imaginative creation, original thought, invention, or discovery.
Wow.
So that genius is tied to originality, and that definition of genius is what C.S. Lewis is calling into question in this essay.
And what you guys can't see in the dictionary is right below that is a picture of David Downing.
Well, being in undergrad and grad school, this idea that you have genius and you don't have genius. He has talent, but he has genius.
Oh,
Yeah.
And when you take classes in literature, I would say, I want to write about Frederick Douglass. And they would say, well, that's important historical literature, but he didn't have the kind of literary genius. They had this literal canon.
Yeah.
That's almost like inspired literature. It's got to be Poe, Hawthorne, Emerson, Thoreau, and Walt Whitman. And if you come up with a different name, they have a reason why they're not really canonical writers.
Oh, wow.
And they even would rather have you read a minor work by Melville. I had a professor tried to get me to write a paper on an unfinished poem called Clarel by Melville, which is not good, but he was in the canon.
But it was written by him, so.
Exactly.
Yeah, since he's a genius, you should study it. David had another professor who was writing an article about a person at the time who was considered a genius, and now nobody talks about anymore, but he was writing an article about how this genius used hyphens. So if it's a genius, study his hyphens, whereas don't read, Frederick Douglass, who was just an amazing human being.
Well, Emerson said, talent dazzles and juggles, but genius realizes and adds.
Wow.
So there's this definite feeling that you've moved over into this this artistic elite that are almost like being a saint.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We do that in a lot of things. I feel like there's that obsession with IQ that was like really big in the 20th century. Like it's kind of died out a little bit, but it would be like, we discovered this guy. He's got an IQ greater than Einstein. He lives in his parents' garage and whatever. I'm like, who cares if he has an IQ greater than Einstein? He's if he's a nobody and he can't put two thoughts together to.
So even when I was a graduate student in the 1980s, there was still that idea of genius. Hence why I would get confronted about the fact that I was a Christian, and there was just this assumption, well, a Christian can't be a genius. And I think I've told this story in the podcast in the past where one of my fellow students in grad school told me, Crystal, you're the first Christian I've ever met who's the least bit intelligent.
Wow.
Yeah. This anti-Christian assumption that lasted until postmodernists started challenging it.
Feels like there's an element of that which is tied to the assumption is that a genius or somebody who's super intelligent is somebody who can think outside the box and be creative and not be constrained by the rules. And so then when you become a Christian, it's like, oh no, well, you've got a color inside the line. So you can no longer be a genius because you've essentially adopted a ball and chain on your foot. You're never going to be Usain Bolt anymore because you've limited your intelligence and your mental capacity by coloring yourself.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like the second essay when he talks about Christianity and culture. No, this is still Christianity literature. What are the key words of modern criticism? Creative with its opposite derivative.
Yes.
Spontaneity with the opposite convention. Freedom contrasted with rules. Great authors are innovators, pioneers, explorers. Bad authors bunch in schools and follow models. Or again, great authors are always breaking fetters and bursting bonds. They have personality. They are themselves. These we call men of genius. So he's quite literally talking about what we've been discussing as the paradigm. There was a strange thing in patent law where if you're trying to get a patent for something, you have to have a flash of genius to prove that it's your idea.
Yeah.
I think this idea has fallen out of favor in legal circles. But the guy who invented
windshield wipers.
The intermittent windshield wipers.
Oh, right.
he tried to sue some companies that started using intermittent windshield wipers. There's a movie about this.
Yeah, Flash of Genius.
Yeah, Flash of Genius. And the idea was to really deserve a patent, you have to have this moment of insight, which is almost like a moment of epiphany.
Huh.
If I was in the legal court, I would say, well, I was on the road to Damascus, and I suddenly said, wouldn't it be great to have intermittent windshield wipers? They've since
And it was
realized,
raining on the road to
exactly,
Damascus.
Yeah.
Oh, apparently, yeah.
But that word genius has such magic in modern culture.
Yeah. Well, even the phrase that we often don't think of anymore, but that term free verse that was developed after the Victorians in the first decade of the 20th century to illustrate this idea that David, you just read, that we're free of Victorian conventions. We're free of expectations that you just do, like in
Like
the
a
18th
certain
century.
meter that you have to use or something?
It's free of meter. It's free of rhyme.
Gotcha.
Pope in the 18th century that great poetry is what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. But now we're free of that. The genius doesn't follow and say things like what people have said in the past. So this is, and it just, you could tell it just drives Lewis crazy.
It's an interesting analogy because even T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, these early 20th century advocates of modern poetry, they thought that free verse was a mistake, or vers libre, they say in French, because in their minds, you could still have these really interesting organic rhythms in poetry, even if it wasn't da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
Uh-huh.
And if you read Proofrock or The Wasteland, they're full of fascinating images.
Yeah. Eliot was a great poet.
Right. But when other people came along and said, oh, free verse,
I'll do whatever I want. Yeah.
it just becomes prose. It just becomes chopped up
Yeah.
prose.
In fact, I would have students who thought they were doing free verse, and they would just, as long as your line doesn't come to the right margin of the page, that turns it into free verse.
Right,
so you just
right.
kind of divide up your
Just kinda
lines.
pick where you-
and
yeah.
it must be a poem because it isn't aligned with the right
Yeah,
hand
that
margin
reminds
of a book.
me of the trend. Wasn't there a trend where they would just take novels and they would cut them up and rearrange
Yes,
them?
yes.
Oh, yeah, that was Dadaism, where they would take random words and put them together.
Right.
That's
right,
really kind of the dead end of artistic theory. It becomes, the whole thing becomes
right.
basically a publicity stunt.
But
Right.
but Lewis is he makes a good point in here, and we probably need to transition. So
Right.
I'll read this quote and then we can transition to the next one. But he's making the point that this idea of either genius and being original is anti-Christian, or the idea of sort of being true to yourself above all things is also not a Christian thing. He says we should get as the basis of all critical theory the maxim that an author should never conceive himself as bringing into existence beauty or wisdom which did not exist before, but simply ensouling as trying to embody in terms of his own art some reflection of eternal beauty and wisdom. Beauty with a
Right.
capital B and a capital
Mhm.
W.
Right.
And then he makes one last point, which he's talked about elsewhere, so I just wanted to quote this because this is something that Lewis, I think, is a valuable insight into life. He says, "It's not hard to argue that the greatest poems have been made by men who valued something else much more than poetry. Even if that something else were only cutting down enemies in a cattle raid or tumbling a girl in a bed, the real frivolity, the solemn vacuity, is all with those who make literature a self-existent thing to be valued for its own sake. Pater prepared for pleasure as if it were martyrdom."
Right.
Right.
What does this mean to
Um,
me? Yeah, he almost sounds like a martyr who's going through a mystical experience when he talks about the Mona Lisa, etc.
Well, he sounds to me, when Peter sounds like someone who's getting ready for worship. If you're getting ready
Yes.
to go to church, you say, I'm going to empty my mind of all my worldly concerns. I'm going to put away my prejudices and so it's almost like a cleansing of the mind to prepare yourself for the worship experience. He uses that very similar language to look at a painting or a sculpture.
Mm-hmm.
And, Lewis quite wittily says it's almost like someone preparing for their martyrdom. I have to get in one more quote on originality, not from Lewis, but from someone that he admired, Samuel Johnson. A young author sent a manuscript to Samuel Johnson, the 18th century author of the great first English dictionary. And Johnson read the manuscript and he says, "What you have to say here is both good and original. Unfortunately, the parts that are good are not original, and the parts that are original are not good. I don't know how many student papers I wanted to write that on.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go on to Christianity and Culture, which was published in the journal Theology in March of 1940. And what I like about this and like about Lewis in general is how he starts by confessing his limitations. Here is the great C.S. Lewis, who is this multi-million-dollar seller for his Narnia stories, for his Ransom trilogy, whose literary criticism has been studied by non-Christians who value it, and yet he admits that he doesn't have all the answers. But part of it is he's preparing us for this essay where he's struggling with two sides of an issue.
Yeah.
The deification of culture, as in Matthew Arnold. Arnold calls one of his essays actually Culture and Anarchy. And the implication is if you don't have culture, you're going to have anarchy. Culture saves our souls is basically what Arnold is saying. And of course, Lewis hates that, but then he has to admit, I've made my whole career on the advocacy of great works of culture.
Yeah, he feels very conflicted in this essay. I was telling Crystal before we got started, it feels like a physician who's been told by his friend, who's also a physician, that he needs to cut salt out of his diet. And he's trying to order at a restaurant, and he's going through and listing off all the things he used to love to eat and saying why maybe he shouldn't eat them now.
Yes.
But it just doesn't feel like the Lewis that we're used to, where he sort of comes in with this clarity of insight. But he's sort of going through and sort of rifling through the drawers in his house and deciding what he's going to keep and what he's going to throw out.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting essay from Lewis.
And he's showing that both sides of the argument have legitimacy.
But I think he does constantly say, why do we have aesthetic objects? And he says often critics will look at this light limerick or just a lighthearted poem, and they'll treat it as this great work of art, which needs to carry a lot of weight of meaning. And so I think he always liked culture. When he was a teenager, he read Shakespeare and Milton and Dante.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until he became a Christian that he said, well, that's kind of aesthetic pleasure, and a certain amount of humanizing of readers is not the same as Christian faith. This came up in our earlier discussion of first and second things. Don't make culture or art the first thing in your life. Find out what's more important than culture and art.
Well, that's why I read that quote earlier, because that's the point he's making is you don't sit down and say, let's have a great discussion. You sit down to have a meal, and then a great discussion happens.
Well, he says in this for culture is not everyone's road to Jerusalem. For some, it is a road out. So for someone like Lewis, he was reading Dante and Shakespeare and Milton and Spencer, and he discovered that he liked all the Christian writers. He said they were great except for their Christianity. And he said all the supposedly profound writers sounded kind of shallow and tinny compared to the Christian writers. So for him, his reading was a stepping stone to faith. I did want to read what he considers to be a value to reading and absorbing culture. He says there's another way in which it may predispose to conversion. This is reading and culture. The difficulty of converting an uneducated man nowadays lies in his complacency. Popularized science, the conventions or unconventions of his immediate circle, party programs, etc., enclose him in a tiny, windowless universe, which he mistakes for the only possible universe. There are no distant horizons, no mysteries. He thinks everything has been settled. A cultured person, on the other hand, is almost compelled to be aware that reality is very odd and that the ultimate truth, whatever it may be, must have the characteristics of strangeness. And I love that idea that being well-read and being cultured, it keeps you from this kind of small-minded complacency, that we have everything figured out in a very small box. So I think you're right. He doesn't want culture to be mistaken for Christian faith, but he does see it having salutary effects on people.
He puts it very succinctly, sort of the question he's wrestling with in this. I wanted to read this quote. It might help kind of frame this. He says, no one presumably is really maintaining that a fine taste in the arts is a condition of salvation. Maybe some of these quotes make it seem like they are, but he's saying, hopefully that's not really what you mean. Yet the glory of God, and as our only means to glorifying him, the salvation of human souls is the real business of life. What then is the value of culture? And so I feel like he's kind of wrestling with this idea of like, what's the point of all these things, these novels, these cultural things? Are they an end to themselves? How can they be if the whole point is to glorify God and to lead people to Christ? They feel like just a distraction, basically. And so he's wrestling with his love of those things that he had before he was a Christian. And then he kind of says, when I became a Christian, I had to all of a sudden go, well, what's the point of these things? Now that I think that there's a different end to life, what's the purpose of them?
He has such a vivid sense of people as immortal souls. He said in several places that uninteresting person that you're chatting with is one day going to either be this majestic creature, rising in the image of Christ, or else they're going to be some kind of devilish, disfigured creature. And he says the least interesting person you ever met is more valuable and more eternal than the greatest work of art that you've ever encountered.
Yeah. He says in here that he became thankful for like bad hymns. He says because he realized that we should have to lay down our precious refinement at the very doorstep of the church. Good that we should be cured at the outset of our inveterate confusion between psyche and pneuma, nature and supernature. He's trying to say it's more important that we understand, who God is and learn to love Jesus and that our souls are saved, than that we understand the distinction between psyche and pneuma.
Hence, I was reminded of Sarah Smith of Golders Green. Is that her name in Great Divorce?
In Great Divorce, right.
Where she's just a charwoman, but her spirit shines out greater than all these more refined intellectuals who are coming from hell to check out heaven.
Yeah, when he sees this this radiant figure, almost like a goddess, and she's surrounded by birds and animals and all of her children and her spiritual children. And who was that? Was she a queen? No, she was she was basically a cleaning lady in a unattractive part of London. I think that's a great insight. If you really think about, am I meeting a Sarah Smith from Golders Green?
Yes.
Physically, they may not be, or economically,
or educationally,
they're not very impressive. But I love that he plants that image. This could be one of the greatest people you've ever met in terms of their spiritual maturity and balance.
He says in the first essay, he's talking about high works of art and high works of culture versus sort of the vulgar works of art that are made for the masses, the sort of broad, today we would call them blockbuster movies or something like that, versus an Oscar-nominated movie. He would say that a Christian knows that the vulgar, since they include most of the poor, probably include his superiors. And that's a very Christian idea that I think we've totally lost sight of, that he throws in there just offhand, saying, if that's what the sort of the masses, the poor, the uneducated are consuming, maybe there's something there, because those people in the Christian view, blessed are the poor in spirit, God lifts those people up, the Sarah Smith of Golders Greens.
But at the same time, the trouble is more vulgar culture can pull them down.
Oh, yeah.
And you think of today with the obsession over social media and Twitter.
Oh, and it becomes a distraction.
Yeah. And people are proclaiming that there's more and more suicide among adolescents, and they are attributing it to social media because it's all about how many likes you get, and it's not about intellectual engagement. It's not even about pleasure. So Lewis is not saying pleasure is bad, but how do we take pleasure of things that lift us up, but also point us to the ultimate love, which is of our Creator God.
Yeah. Well, he mentions two people in here that I thought would be worth talking about. I wanted to ask you guys about them. So he sort of two views of culture. One of them is that he calls the Gregorian view, that culture is a weapon, and it's a weapon that we lay aside as soon as we safely can. And so this is Pope Gregory. And then the other one is Cardinal Newman.
Right.
And I wanted to mention that one because we actually read this essay in the Wheaton Theology program when we were talking about theology and culture. And it's a very sort of Wheaton view of culture. So can you guys talk about that? Because he kind of finds positives and negatives.
Well, I like the fact that he uses Newman to identify that there are two sides to this issue, and Newman, at different parts of his writings, argues opposite sides. Here's how he summarizes. Lewis states, "No one ever insisted so eloquently as Newman on the beauty of culture for its own sake, and no one ever so sternly resisted the temptation to confuse it, culture, with things spiritual." So once again, we're back to it's both and.
Ding, 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 ding.
And that's, I think Lewis is remembering that passage because that's Lewis's own dilemma.
Yeah.
Crystal, remind us of this famous essay by Niebuhr on four models for the interaction between Christianity and culture.
Yeah.
This is a famous essay, and I think Lewis is kind of
Anticipates
fitting
it.
into that paradigm.
Yeah.
Oh, so this is before Niebuhr's essay?
No, Lewis is before Niebuhr.
Okay, all right, gotcha.
So this is H. Richard Niebuhr wrote a book that was published in 1951 that's called Christ and Culture. And it was so influential that Harper San Francisco republished it in 2001 as a 50th anniversary edition.
Oh, wow.
So Niebuhr was really speaking to Christians struggling over this issue. And he says that there are basically 5 responses to culture that are displayed by different Christians. One is Christ against culture. The second is the Christ of culture. Third, Christ above culture. Fourth, Christ and culture in paradox. And fifth, Christ transforming culture. The trouble today is, as some people have pointed out, is all too often Christians in the 21st century have added yet a 6th category that is Christ following culture. It's kind of like, oh, how can we use TikTok? How can we use Instagram?
Oh, there's rock music. Let's have Christian rock music.
Yeah.
There's rappers. Let's have Christian rappers.
Yeah.
Right.
You're always chasing after the fad.
Let's make Christian movies.
Oh my gosh! When I was when in the '90s, when I was in high school, there was these things where it would be like, oh, if you like this secular band, here's the Christian band that sounds like that. You know?
Yeah,
Talk about Christ
the worst
following
kind of
culture.
imitation.
Well, but
Yeah.
the idea was it's Christianity against culture. So we don't want to have anything to do with culture.
I see.
But
Yeah.
we like certain aspects of culture. We're going to sort of co-opt them. So we'll make music that sounds like Nirvana, but we'll put Christian lyrics behind it. And it was, we're sort of rejecting and embracing them at the same time. It was very strange. Same thing with like watching a Christian movie instead of a secular movie.
Mhm.
And often what Sayer's talking about, the only Christian work is work well done.
Good work, well done. Yeah.
They're falling down on the well done part. Briefly, like Christ against culture, an extreme example would be the Amish, which is we
Right.
just need to get away from secular culture.
Yeah.
We don't want their music. We don't want their TV. We don't want their electricity.
Cars. Yeah.
So that's an extreme example. Give me some other examples. The one about Christ transforming culture is, would you call that a reformed view?
More reformed.
That
yes.
Christianity can take culture which is struggling to find answers. Like someone like Francis Schaeffer, he felt like if you really have a good grip on Christianity, you can use it to help contemporary culture come out of its morass.
Mm-hmm.
What are the other ones, and how would you illustrate
Christ
them?
of culture. I haven't read Niebuhr's book in a long time, so I'm just going on shadowy memories. But Christ of culture is that culture has great Christian art was produced in the medieval times. And in fact, you get some art critics now who are revising that idea of medievalism. We talked about medievalism in recent podcasts, where if it's medieval, it's something not to be valued. We have to go back to neoclassicism. The Greeks and the Romans, they were the great artists, and then medieval culture, and then the Renaissance. It's called the rebirth of real culture. And C.S. Lewis, interestingly, hated that word Renaissance. He said, but it was a word invented by, I think by Victorians. It might have been 18th century to say that we have to surmount this dead time of medievalism. But now, thanks partly to postmodernism, people are going back and saying, man, the art, and especially the architecture produced by Christians, in order to glorify God, was much more sophisticated than Greek and Roman architecture. That was Paul Johnson talked about that. Remember him?
Yeah, he did do that. And Lewis says that the whole idea of a Dark Ages or a Middle Ages or medieval, you're literally skipping over 1,000 years of music, architecture,
culture.
literature,
Yes.
in order to. It's funny how people have these self-congratulatory terms. Even the Enlightenment is, well, things were dark, and we're here to bring light on the subject. So Lewis said that the Renaissance never happened in England, and if it did, it was of no importance. he saw complete continuity between the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. He didn't see this big cultural break.
Gotcha. Well, he kind of comes to the conclusion at the end, after all of this sort of waffling over the menu at the deli. He says, my general case may be stated in Ricardian terms, which you guys are going to have to explain that.
I assume he means I.A. Richards.
Yeah, I.A. Richards.
Who I quoted earlier in the podcast.
That culture is a storehouse of the best sub-Christian values. These values are in themselves of the soul, not the spirit, but God created the soul. Its values may be expected, therefore, to contain some reflection or antepast of the spiritual values. They will save no man. They resemble the regenerate life only as affection resembles charity, or honor resembles virtue, or the moon the sun. But though like is not the same, it is better than unlike. Imitation may pass into initiation. For some, it is a good beginning. For others, it is not. Culture is not everyone's road into Jerusalem, and for some, it is a road out. So where does he land here? Can you guys help explain this? And then also, I want to touch on, he mentioned something about Sehnsucht at the end and questioning whether he can repent of Sehnsucht.
Well, I think when you mentioned a spirit and soul, that's why I use the word psyche and pneuma.
Oh, yeah.
Psyche to mean soul and pneuma to mean spirit. And so culture takes as far as you can get by natural revelation. Lewis was a very strong believer in natural revelation. We have the moral law. We have mythology, which has dreams of dying gods. We have numinous experiences where we feel something larger and more majestic and mysterious has entered into our life. And we have Sehnsucht. We have this longing for paradise. So he had a very high view of natural revelation, but you can't stop there. You can't end up being a cultured pagan.
Yeah.
And he felt that when he uses the word pagan, he means pre-Christian. These were the people like Virgil when Christianity came, they were open to it. They said, oh, this is what we've been looking for.
Yeah.
And hence Virgil, the great Roman poet, becomes the guide to the Inferno and Purgatorio and Dante.
Gotcha.
Well, he also lists various qualities of European literature, and they are honor, sexual love, material prosperity, pantheistic contemplation of nature, Sehnsucht, awakened by the past, liberation of impulses. These were called sub-Christian. And what's interesting is that he goes back and he says two of these categories that were just implicit in European literature, we can reject. And he says, and it makes sense that he says liberation of impulses, you know, just if it feels good, do it, which is kind of the attitude that is dominating our own time now. But the other one that he says is inherently non-Christian wasn't sexual love. People might have thought that because, of course, sexual love is a gift of God. But the other one that is inherently non-Christian is material prosperity. And it really flies in the face of what is a current aberration in Christianity called prosperity theology, health and wealth gospel. This idea that, well, if you pray enough, you see God's blessing by material prosperity.
I wanted to go back to Pope Gregory. At the end of Christianity literature, he says that when Pope Gregory got to heaven, he found out his whole theory of theological hierarchies was incorrect, and he just started laughing. He thought it was the funniest thing he ever heard.
Yeah, Dante puts that in his Paradiso.
And I wonder if the end of Leaf by Nigel, we talked about on an earlier episode, when Nigel and Parrish hear that the realm of heaven which they've cultivated is now known as Nigel's Parish, he said they both laughed until the mountains rang. I wonder if that is Tolkien
Oh,
echoing this incident from Dante.
interesting. Wow.
That is an interesting thing to include from Lewis because it helps put everything in perspective in terms of talking about culture and literature. Like, what,
right.
in the end, what will survive?
Lewis is giving this list of all these Christian authorities who don't really value originality. They're really saying we're here to imitate Christ. Even when Paul says, imitate me, he's thinking of himself as a mature enough Christian that young Christians should look at the way he does things.
Yeah.
And he talks about Christians see a life as the art of imitation. He mentions Milton. He mentions these famous Christian thinkers.
Yeah, Augustine.
One of the ones he mentions is the Theologica Germanica. And a lot of readers might say, what is that doing in there? But I wanted to remind them that this was a very influential 14th century text. It was in German. It was discovered by Martin Luther, who really edited and published it. And really, he said after the Bible and Augustine, it was the most important thing he read. We have an annotated copy of Theologica Germanica that Lewis owned at the Wade Center. And his annotations are fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
The author is unknown. He's sometimes called a man from Frankfurt, or even worse, a Frankfurter. This great mystical writer. It was written by a Frankfurter, really.
I thought it was a man from Hamburger.
No, I checked. It was Frankfurt.
Oh, okay.
So it was written by a hot dog, not a hamburger. But in any case, when he reads, he does talk about how we only imitate God in our spirituality. And he has this passage which Lewis underlined. If you ask the sun, why do you shine? The sun says, I shine because I'm the sun. That's my nature and my property. But I don't try to keep the light. I everlastingly give it away. And Lewis marked that. And several times in his writings, he says, I believe in Christianity as I believe in the sun. By its light, I see everything else. The writer also talks about the real spiritual struggle is not the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. It's between God and self, your God self and your me self.
That's in the Theological Germanica.
Yeah. He actually says, nothing is contrary to God but self-will, and self-will is self-defeating. Lewis underlined that. When you read Great Divorce, it's interesting that he put the date of his reading right near the time he was reading Great Divorce. These people are not being dragged back to hell by devils. It's their own self-will which is defeating them and keeping them from going on into heaven. So I just thought it was worth, if people run across that title and they're struck by how it doesn't seem to fit with all these famous figures.
Yeah.
It'd be go back to review him. He also says in Theologica Germanica, he says, nothing burns in hell but self-will. And that's this idea of burning away the impurities that we find so much in George MacDonald that Lewis loved. So it's a fascinating read, and it's fascinating that he had such a high view of this book that he listed it along with the Bible and Augustine and Milton and these other great figures.
In fact, this essay is a good education in people who deify art and culture versus Christians then who go to the opposite extreme and repudiate culture. And then Lewis trying to say, how do we strike a delicate balance?
Right. There's an irony here in that Lewis is saying, let's not turn culture into a religion. And so he's kind of putting culture in its place, capital C culture. But here he is, one of the most cultivated and cultured and well-read men in the 20th century.
Right.
In the second essay, he's kind of putting down the cult of originality and saying, as Christians, we're trying to imitate God. We're not trying to be original.
Yeah.
And he says, just try to speak truly, and what people call originality will. But he's also one of the most original minds of the 20th century. The Great Divorce, there's nothing like it. The Screwtape Letters, nobody ever came up with such a brilliant idea of listening to how Satan would view spiritual problems. So I just love the irony that this greatly cultured man is talking about the limits of culture.
Yeah.
And this incredibly original person is talking about don't get obsessed with originality.
Well, it reminds me of the Four Loves when he talks about friendship love. And he says, if you try to generate a friendship, so you're just looking at each other, let's be friends.
Yeah.
That's not going to work. But if you're both focused on something else and discover, you like that too.
Yeah.
So for Lewis, he's saying the trouble with modernists, they were so focused on originality that they were just and producing abstract art that now looks kind of cheesy. Whereas, and that wasn't genius. We saw one painting that was just entirely painted blue, and we were in the Tate Gallery in London, and someone said, it really makes you think about blue. What a genius that person was.
Yeah.
So for Lewis, he doesn't focus on genius, but he's focusing on truth as he understands it, and of course guided by Scripture, by both the Word of God as Jesus and the Word of God as the Bible. And he achieves genius by not trying to be a genius.
Yeah. He says in here, he's talking about St. Augustine and talking about in the first essay about Christianity and literature, and he's saying, I'm saying only that the highest good of a creature must be creaturely, that it is derivative or reflective, that a purpose of our existence is to reflect Christ and or to be more like him. And then he says, like Augustine makes plain, pride does not only go before a fall, but is a fall of the creature's attention from what is better, God, to what is worse, itself. And I feel like that's a very good, maybe a good summary of both of these, that when we make these things into something that places the attention on ourselves, or it becomes a distraction for ourselves, and it takes our attention from God, it becomes a thing that, pulls us away from God. It becomes a thing that's not good anymore, but it can direct us to devotion or lead us to the Lord, and it's that two-way road in and out of Jerusalem.
Right. Yeah, there's an old saying, the good is the enemy of the best. And in many ways, I think there's an underlying motif in both these essays of humility. Human culture can only rise so far, but it can't become an end in itself. It's only a pointer to the next step. And your originality and your ideas don't make you a genius or don't make you a great artist.
Yeah.
So I like the fact that there's kind of an unspoken humility in both these essays. Later in life, Walter Hooper was having lunch with Lewis, and Lewis said, "No, what do people say about me? What's the general impression of me around Oxford?" And Hooper said, "Well, they say you're rather prideful."
Aww.
And Lewis put his head down, and he said, "I've been fighting with that my whole life." But that's a very humble answer.
Yes.
Yeah.
A prideful person would go, "What do you mean I'm prideful? Just because I'm knowledgeable and well-spoken, that doesn't mean I'm prideful."
Yeah.
But he actually had this humble response of he still needed to work on pride.
Wow.
And I think that comes up even as literary essays.
Here is a sentence that we might close with. It comes from Christianity and Culture, and it summarizes much of what we've been talking about. Aaron has used the word reflection that C.S. Lewis uses in the first essay, and this one from the second essay compares culture to moonlight. And he says, "It is lawful to rest our eyes in moonlight, especially now that we know where it comes from, that it is only sunlight at second hand."
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.